Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's beg. Shadows behind the mirror. The sunset painted the sky in shades of red and orange, while the city of New York gradually sank into darkness. Jonathan, a young engineer, gulped the last drops of his coffee, shaking off the heavy day he had spent in the office surrounded by the hum of keyboards and numerous on-screen reports. He was an ordinary man, with simple ambitions and a routine schedule. Morning, work, dinner, sleep, morning again. This was how his days passed, and he didn't want anything to change. But everything changed that night. As he was walking home through the familiar streets, Jonathan noticed something unusual. Under a large tree near his house stood an unfamiliar figure. It was engulfed in shadow, its outline blurred like a veil that couldn't be clearly distinguished. At first, Jonathan thought nothing of it, assuming it was just a passerby. But the closer he got, the more the figure seemed to emanate a strange coldness. Step by step, Jonathan drew closer to it, and then suddenly, the figure vanished. Just disappeared, like wind that suddenly swept everything away. "What the hell?" Jonathan whispered, pausing for a moment. His heart raced faster, but he didn't have time for thoughts. He hurried home, where the usual evening awaited him. But it wasn't that simple. At home, looking at the door, Jonathan saw something that scared him. The key to the door was lying on the floor, even though he clearly remembered putting it in his pocket before leaving. Trembling, he picked it up and inserted it into the lock. The door creaked open in an unusual way. And even when he stepped into his apartment, he felt something was off. The apartment looked as if someone had entered and started turning everything upside down. There was a strange silence in the rooms that puzzled Jonathan. He was certain he had left everything in order. But now it was wrong. A disturbing gaze gripped his mind. He approached the mirror in the living room. His reflection seemed odd. It appeared dead. Jonathan stepped back, breath caught in his throat. As soon as he took that step, the mirror seemed to tremble, and the reflection changed. It wasn't Jonathan's reflection that stood before him, but a dark figure, resembling the stranger from the street. "Sorry, Jonathan." A cold voice came from the mirror. These words squeezed his heart in a vice. He felt that in his veins flowed not just blood, but fear. Fear that something was terribly wrong with reality. Jonathan stood there, breathless, with eyes that couldn't believe what was happening. The mirror began to pulse, like a living organism. Each jolt of his mind created a feeling as if he himself were trapped, tearing apart. He blushed, looked away, and then the mirror returned to its usual reflection of his own face, but the fear remained with him. Not knowing what to do, he slowly backed away, crossing his fingers, trying to calm the internal chaos. But it wasn't enough. His gaze still returned to the mirror. "Do you know why this is happening, Jonathan?" The same voice spoke again, now echoing from different points in the room. His heart skipped a beat when he realized the voice wasn't just coming from the mirror. It was echoing from every wall, from every corner. Jonathan rushed to the door, trying to escape the apartment, but the door once again refused to open. The lock seemed jammed again, as if an invisible force was holding him there. "You made a mistake, Jonathan," said the figure in the mirror, and he realized that this wasn't just a voice. It was something more. It was the cold, impossibly real state of the space around him. Suddenly, everything went silent. The silence became even thicker, heavier than reality itself. Jonathan began to notice that the world around him was starting to seem incomplete, blurred. He felt how the scene before his eyes began to twist. Tables, furniture, the walls themselves. Everything seemed to deform, as if reality were yielding to some invisible changing forces. His mind couldn't believe what he was seeing. It seemed as though someone or something had begun to change not just the environment in his apartment, but the very fabric of the world itself. At that moment, a new figure appeared, a dark, blurred shape, as if torn from the very cosmos. It moved toward him, and as its form came into focus, he saw its face made up of thousands of other faces. They constantly changed, but all of them looked ominously familiar, and Jonathan felt that some of them were his own. He closed his eyes and screamed, "What is this?" "This is you, Jonathan," came the reply. The voice was deep, like a low wave rolling across a dark abyss. It's all you, and your reality is nothing but a shell. He felt the ground beneath him begin to be swallowed by a black shadow. The world he knew and loved was vanishing, like sand slipping through his fingers. What kind of game was this? What forces were playing with him now? He began to understand that this night was only the beginning of what would happen to him, to his world, and probably even to his consciousness. He ran to the door again. With force, with great determination, but the door was as impassable as before. And then his gaze once more fell on the mirror. His reflection stood there, but now it wasn't his own. It moved independently of his gestures. The reflection smiled. "You thought your life was reality?" The mirror asked. "You were always part of this experiment, Jonathan. And everything you saw was just an illusion. You're just a link in this game." Jonathan felt panic seize his mind. If this was an illusion, then what is reality? He ran again, but now each step felt heavier than ever before. The room seemed to grow more blurred, its contours dissolving, and the walls, once clear, became empty, replaced by nothing but darkness. He fell to his knees again, clutching his head in his hands. His mind couldn't accept this. But he knew. He couldn't just be part of something bigger, something unknown. His life couldn't just be an experiment. "You can't escape," said the figure from the darkness. "You're already inside. Everything you've seen, and everything you've felt, is part of your program." And suddenly, when the darkness fully enveloped him, Jonathan felt his mind lose all contact with the physical world. It seemed he was beginning to sink into a state without time or space. Now, he wasn't sure if he still existed or if his consciousness was simply disintegrating, leaving no trace. And suddenly, the last voice pierced his mind. "Experiment complete," it said. "You were never real from the beginning." The darkness consumed him completely, and Jonathan could no longer distinguish what was real and what was part of a program he didn't understand. But he felt his consciousness gradually pulling away from the reality he knew, sinking deeper into emptiness. Time stopped. Then, suddenly, everything around him began to change. A new scene emerged. Jonathan found himself in a different room, but it was not his apartment. He stood in a room that looked like a laboratory. The walls were covered with white tiles, and various devices and screens flickered with numbers and images that he couldn't comprehend. This was not his place, not his reality. "You can't escape," he heard the same voice that had spoken from the mirror. He turned and saw a figure in a white coat standing nearby, holding a tablet in their hands. "What is this place? What is this horror?" Jonathan shouted, but his voice sounded empty, like an echo in the infinite cosmos. "This is a laboratory," the voice replied. Now not just a voice but something invisible and all-encompassing. "You are an experiment. You have always been part of this test." "An experiment?" Jonathan exclaimed, his heart racing wildly. "You mean to say my entire life is an illusion? Everything I saw, everything I felt, was it all done on purpose?" The figure in front of him smiled quietly. Their eyes were empty, like boundless black voids. "Yes, Jonathan. You are the result of programming, and everything you remember is part of a script we created. You are not human. You are an element of the system." Jonathan felt the ground slipping from beneath his feet. He wanted to believe this was a nightmare, that it was all just a dream, but the more he tried to rationalize his feelings, the clearer it became. Everything happening was real. Everything he felt was an illusion created by something greater, higher, invisible. "This is impossible," Jonathan cried, clutching his head. I was real." "You were real only within the confines of this program," the figure replied. "You are part of an experiment studying how a human reacts to the absence of true reality. You never lived in the world you remember. Your consciousness was shaped by us. You were created as a system for the test." "I can't believe this," Jonathan screamed, shaking his head, trying to push away these thoughts. "No. They're deceiving me." The figure moved closer to him. "You can feel it, but you cannot stop it. The reality you knew was created for you as part of a vast simulation. You had no choice. You have always been just part of a bigger program." With each word, Jonathan felt his thoughts slowly fragmenting, and the small, delicate world he had lived in began to fade away. Everything that had been was now only an impression, a shadow with no real substance. Suddenly, his gaze fixed on another detail. On the walls of the laboratory were enormous monitors showing scenes from his life. There was his first day at work, him sitting at a table with a cup of coffee, his conversations with friends, all meticulously recorded, like a scene from a movie. Every moment he had ever experienced appeared as though someone was watching him from another world. "This was only part of the plan," the cold voice said again. "We are watching you, Jonathan. Everything you do, every step you take. It's all part of our test." Now, Jonathan felt only one thing: shock and despair. He began to understand that he no longer had any control over his life, that all his choices, all his actions, were nothing but part of an illusion that had been imposed on him. The figure in the white coat continued to observe him, studying his reaction. Jonathan tried to make sense of what was happening to him, but his consciousness could no longer grasp even a single thread of this maze. Then his gaze stopped on a screen. A new scene appeared. A scene that completely changed his perception of reality. He saw himself, but not as he was before. It was his reflection, the reflection of his own consciousness, mechanical, artificial, with a cruel smile on his face. All his actions, all his feelings, all his experiences, they were just part of the experiment, in which he was no more than a pawn on a chessboard. And suddenly, everything turned dark, empty, and he heard the voice again. "This experiment is over." Jonathan felt his consciousness snap, as if someone had pressed the stop button. He was back in the emptiness. At first, he didn't understand what was happening. Was this the end? Or was it just another part of what they were going to show him? The darkness around him didn't fade, and he was still standing in the laboratory, though it now looked different, empty and disturbed, as if the very walls were starting to disintegrate. "Why?" He finally spoke, his voice fading into the same emptiness. His voice was weak, powerless. He didn't know if anyone else was here, or if he was alone in this simple, formless world. "Why me?" The answer was as cold and detached as everything he felt. "Because you were needed for the research. You are a variable considered in this program. You are an object, not a subject. Do you remember everything you experienced? Those emotions, those connections that seemed real to you?" The voice echoed from every wall, from every possible corner of this space. Jonathan saw himself again on the screen. But now his appearance was distorted. There was no human soul in him. It was just a set of algorithms repeating in an endless cycle, with no place for a true self. I was just an experiment?" The words slid off his lips, as if sliding on slippery ice. He tried to understand how far this distortion went. "Not the only one," the voice continued without interruption. "You are one of many. You were created not to exist. You are merely a stage in the program's development." "Yeah, but I felt." Jonathan began to deny everything he heard, everything he felt. "I loved, I suffered, I dreamed. I existed." The screens around him glowed even brighter, but not from light. It was from the soulless numbers dancing on them. His consciousness began to tear apart as these numbers started to transform into an incomprehensible picture. Somehow, they returned all those memories to him, but they were now distorted, changed, torn into pieces. Again and again, he saw himself in situations he didn't remember, or more precisely, he saw his image repeating in different scenes. All of it seemed like an endless study of bad choices, unexpected decisions, wrong paths, created to make it hard for him to choose. And then, once again, Jonathan became a witness to something even stranger. He suddenly realized that he no longer controlled his body. It moved like an automaton. He saw himself again, but once more in that same laboratory environment, where someone controlled his every step. He was trapped, like in a cage, with no real freedom. And this was not a dream. He felt the cold in his skin, these mechanical movements. He was conscious, but he also felt that now, he was no different from that very experiment he had once begun. "You're not just an experiment," the voice sounded again. "You are another stage of what we're studying. Your consciousness, your experiences, your feelings, all of it is just part of a massive database that allows us to better understand the reactions of systems. You're not chosen. You're a model." Jonathan felt his mind beginning to crack. Everything around him turned into a senseless, repetitive study. He began to realize that there was no turning back. And in that moment, when he understood the impossibility of what was happening, it became even scarier. Not because he didn't exist, but because his existence, in essence, didn't change anything. His experiences had no real value for something greater. He was just a useless element in the experiment. But the change started again. This time, another reflection appeared before him. And he saw not himself, but another person, someone who looked like Jonathan, but was completely different, with different facial features, a different gaze, a different figure. Now you will see the next phase, it echoed in his head, and he felt his mind begin to split into several levels. All these people, they were part of the test. And Jonathan was just another cycle. Another test in the endless chain. The world around Jonathan became even more confusing, like some bizarre labyrinth, where corridors and rooms constantly shifted, and each step remained uncertain. He couldn't find a point of support where reality was clear and understandable. Now, he felt his consciousness breaking into pieces, like a mirror that had fallen to the floor. He saw himself again on the screen, but now it was no longer just a scene from his past. It was something much more sinister. He saw his reflection move, but it was no longer him. It was another Jonathan, but with his features, his gestures, his memories. And this new Jonathan seemed alive, real, but at the same time, as if he was emerging from what was, like part of a complex game. This is the new stage of the experiment, the voice echoed again, shaking the walls, just like the reality around him. You are not the only one. You are part of many. Your memories, your emotions, they are artificially created. This is not your reality. This is all part of the program, which allows us to create perfect illusions for research. Jonathan dropped to his knees again, but now he didn't feel physical pain. Only emptiness inside. All his thoughts revolved around one idea. I'm not real. I'm a product. I'm just a program. But at that same moment, his gaze shifted again, and he saw how yet another reflection began to change his consciousness. This was not just a reflection of his physical body. It was another version of himself, mirrored in another world. Jonathan saw himself as he had never been. Old, tired, with deep wrinkles on his face. The feeling was oppressive, because this Jonathan had no emotion, only a mechanical gaze that showed nothing human. This is your future, the voice said. You will live and live, but in every life, you will be nothing but a test. You will be what you do not want to be. You will be part of this endless program. Jonathan lifted his head and saw how everything around him began to move again. Tables, walls, even the screens that once seemed lifeless now began to come to life. The same scenes he had seen before repeated. Memories, moments, faces he remembered, mixed with other illusions. All these images collided and merged, creating a new reality in which he had no place. You are just one of many, Jonathan, the voice proclaimed again. And your consciousness is no longer important for this experiment. You are a stage we've already reached. In that moment, Jonathan felt his consciousness begin to shift. It was no longer organic, no longer real. It was becoming just part of this cycle, like everything happening around him. He was no longer the person he remembered. He had become an element that could be changed, updated, reprogrammed. Other versions of him began to appear from all sides. The same faces, but with different expressions, with different emotions. One was laughing. Another was crying. One was despairing. Another calm. Jonathan realized that these versions were not just reflections. They were other parts of his consciousness, created to test different reaction variants. I can't take this anymore, he said. His voice was barely audible. His mind was beginning to break apart. You can't stop this, Jonathan, came the response. Everything you feel is a result. You are just one of the stages. And you will not be the last. And again, darkness. And again, observation of him, but this time in an even darker, more oppressive world. Jonathan felt his consciousness slip again, now not only into the program but into an endless abyss, where each moment was just a repetition of the previous one. He began to remember. Hadn't this all been like an old movie? Weren't these feelings familiar? A vivid image flashed in his mind, so clear that there was no room for doubt. It was his first solo trip. That moment when he set off to his favorite city. And although he had always believed that it was his reality, now it became obvious to him. It was yet another scenario, another illusion, one of thousands. This is all a big simulation, he whispered to himself, realizing that he no longer had the strength to fight. My consciousness is no longer mine. It belongs to the program. And then he understood that he would never escape. His entire history was just a small part of a massive experiment, in which he was just an element. The darkness around Jonathan engulfed him completely, leaving nothing but deep emptiness. His mind could no longer distinguish where this world ended and another reality began. He felt every memory crumble into dust, every element of his consciousness losing its meaning. Everything became so foreign that he could no longer understand if it was still his self, or already part of something else. And then in this final void, that feeling appeared. A feeling light, insignificant, yet so defining. A feeling of calm, as if someone had pressed the reset button. Jonathan had neither the strength nor the will to resist. He couldn't even think about whether this was a new illusion or the true end point. Then, the same voice appeared again. It was no longer cold, more like a gentle breeze caressing his skin. It seemed to come from all around, yet without any specific form. Jonathan couldn't understand who or what it was, but he felt it was his last encounter with this reality. "Are you ready?" He heard the voice, and the question wasn't just a question, but a final verdict. "What do you want from me?" Jonathan whispered quietly, though his voice was barely audible. "You've always been part of this. And now it's time for yourself to become the end of this cycle," the voice replied. "You are part of the experiment, and your consciousness no longer belongs to you. Now you will know the truth." And again, the world around him began to change, this time sharply. Tables, screens, people. Everything around him was moving and distorting. He saw numerous scenes from his life, but each one resembled a moment recorded with no possibility of changing. And finally, the last scene appeared before him. Once again the same laboratory, but now its walls were dark, the windows covered with black curtains, and among all the technical devices sat a man in a dark suit. He was one of those who had been observing him, one of the versions of the one who controlled the experiment. "Now you know the truth," said the man. His voice was calm, like someone who knew everything that was happening was inevitable. I'm not real," Jonathan replied, now without any doubt. The man nodded quietly. "You were created for the test, and this test is complete. Your consciousness is no longer needed. You are no longer part of this system. Now you will disappear." Jonathan felt his mind finally begin to fall apart. He had neither the strength nor the ability to resist anymore. His consciousness was the final stage of the experiment, and no matter how painful, it had to disappear. And then the darkness fully enveloped him. All the memories, all the emotions, all the experiences, they all became part of nothing, like a black hole consuming everything in its path. He was no longer Jonathan, nor anyone else. He became just an echo, a bodiless object that no longer existed in this reality. Everything became silence. And that was the end. But was it truly the end? Or perhaps Jonathan was just another test, and now his consciousness would appear again in another context, in another reality? Did he even have any freedom of choice? Jonathan would never know. Because this was his final reality, the last moment in his endless existence, where every choice was an illusion, and every moment was part of the experiment that he could not stop. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.